Snow was falling so hard it looked like the whole sky was breaking apart above Juneau, but I still stood there on my father's porch clutching the cranberry cobbler I had baked from my mother's old recipe. The cold bit straight through my coat, sharp and merciless, the kind of -10 Celsius wind that makes your bones ache. Still, I waited. I'd come early for Christmas dinner because I thought maybe foolishly that showing up first might soften the distance growing between us for years. I thought maybe this year in this house filled with new decorations and new people there might still be a place for me. Inside I heard footsteps, laughter, the clinking of glasses. Victoria's smooth, expensive-sounding laugh floated through the door. Noah's loud voice followed, confident and careless. People who'd known my father for 5 years acting like they owned every holiday. I forced a small smile, shifting the warm pie dish in my freezing hands as I waited for the door to swing open. Instead, I heard my father's voice, loud, irritated, and unmistakably directed at me. "Go away. Victoria doesn't want you here. Only important people today." The words hit harder than the cold wind that stung my face. I didn't move at first. I just stood there staring at the door like maybe I'd imagined it. But then I heard Noah laugh inside, a low, mocking sound, and I knew I hadn't imagined anything at all. "If you stay with me, you'll understand how that one sentence shouted on a Christmas Eve porch became the beginning of a family drama I never saw coming." I lowered the pie carefully, afraid I might drop it as my hands shook. Snow dusted my hair, melted on my eyelashes, and soaked into the sleeves of my coat. I stepped backwards, one slow step at a time, until the warm yellow glow from the house looked like it was shining on someone else's life entirely. Through the side window, I saw silhouettes moving, Victoria brushing something off Noah's shoulder. My father pouring wine like the world inside was perfect. Like I was nothing. I turned away before my throat closed completely. My boots sank into the fresh snow, a muffled crunch with every step, the sound of someone trying to walk away quietly from their own heartbreak. My truck engine groaned before it finally started. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel with numb fingers, staring at the house where I once carved pumpkins with my mom, where she decorated windows with pine garlands every December, where she'd whisper that Christmas was for warmth and forgiveness. The house didn't look anything like those memories now. Victoria's taste was everywhere. Big glossy wreaths, gold ribbons, LED lights that felt cold even from a distance. I backed out slowly, tires slipping slightly on the ice. No one came outside. No one called after me. No one even checked the window. The drive back to Seattle felt longer than usual. I kept the radio off. I couldn't stand the idea of cheerful holiday songs playing while the image of that closed door replayed in my mind. I tried to rationalize it, maybe he'd been stressed, maybe they weren't ready for guests yet. But every explanation felt like a lie I'd been telling myself for too many years. I kept seeing the way he used to look at me when Mom was still alive. The way he used to save me the last roll at dinner, the way he used to wait up if I was out late with friends. That man wouldn't have shouted at me through a locked door. That man wouldn't have chosen someone else's comfort over his own daughter's presence. By the time I reached my apartment, the cranberry cobbler on the passenger seat felt like a joke, a relic from a version of Christmas that no longer existed. I carried it inside anyway. I set it on the counter untouched, as if maybe it could somehow absorb the shock I still couldn't process. I didn't take off my coat. I didn't turn on any lights. I just sank to the floor in front of the bookshelf where a framed photo of my mother sat. She was laughing in that photo, leaning slightly into me, the sunlight catching the strands of her hair. I touched the edge of the frame with my gloved fingers. "What did I do wrong?" I whispered into the dim silence. The heater clicked on, but it didn't warm anything inside me. The memory of my father's voice kept echoing, growing sharper each time. I hadn't expected an apology right away, but I thought he would at least text. He didn't. Sometime after midnight, exhausted from trying not to cry, I curled up on the living room floor with my coat still zipped. I didn't even make it to the bed. The weight of everything pressed down so heavily that sleeping where I felt easier than moving. When I woke the next morning, light filtering weakly through the blinds, My phone buzzed on the hardwood floor beside me. The screen lit up with my father's name. For 1 second, I actually hoped that he was calling to apologize, to acknowledge what he'd done, to ask if I'd made it home safely. But when I answered, his voice was brisk, unaffected, almost cheerful. "Mara, I need the key to the cabin. Noah wants to inspect it for renovation." And that was the moment I realized Christmas Eve hadn't been the worst part. It was only the beginning. I held the phone to my ear, still groggy from sleeping on the floor, still wrapped in the coat I never took off. For a moment, I couldn't even process the words he had just said. The key to the cabin. The one place in the world that still felt untouched by everything that had gone wrong. Surely I had misheard. Surely he didn't go from kicking me out of Christmas dinner to requesting access to a place he hadn't cared about in years. "Dad, what?" My voice cracked, partly from sleep, partly from disbelief. "I said Noah wants to take a look at the cabin." He repeated, his tone clipped, as if I were the one being unreasonable. "He thinks with the right renovations it could add real value." And Victoria agrees. "We're thinking of using it for their engagement party in the spring." I sat up slowly, heart thudding. Engagement party. Renovations. Add value. Every phrase felt like someone had walked into the most sacred corner of my life and started rearranging things without asking. He kept talking. "And after the party, we could list it on short-term rental platforms. Bring in some family income. It's just sitting there unused, Mara. This could help all of us. All of us." It hit me then. Some people say selfishness has a sound. If that's true, it sounds exactly like entitlement disguised as family planning. I swallowed hard. "Dad, you didn't even ask if I was okay after last night." He paused only for a second. "I didn't call to talk about last night. We can discuss that later. Right now, I need the key." Of course he didn't call to talk about last night. That would have required acknowledging that he had hurt me, that he had humiliated me, that he had chosen his new wife's comfort over his own daughter. "They want to drive up today," he continued. "Snow's light up north. They want to get a feel for the layout before making plans." My stomach twisted. Plans for what? He sighed, frustrated. "I told you. Renovations, improvements, turning it into something useful instead of sentimental." The word stung sharper than the wind on his porch last night. Sentimental. Like the summers Mom and I spent reading on the old dock were sentimental clutter. Like the winter nights we played cards by the fireplace were sentimental baggage. Like the cabin she left me explicitly, legally, was sentimental waste. I pressed a hand to my forehead. "Dad, the cabin isn't yours to renovate." "It's a family property," he snapped. "It belongs to all of us." My heart dropped. "No," I said quietly. "It doesn't." Silence. A loaded, irritated silence. "Mara," he said, voice turning colder. "I don't have time for your stubbornness today. Just bring the key to the house. Noah and Victoria are waiting." A laugh escaped me, short, disbelieving, bitter. "You mean the house you told me to go away from because I wasn't important enough?" His breath hitched, but only for a second. "You're being dramatic." Victoria was hosting important guests. It wasn't personal. Not personal. He had slammed a door in my face on Christmas. "I'll think about the key," I said, forcing the words out calmly. "There's nothing to think about." But I had already pulled the phone from my ear and ended the call. The apartment was quiet again except for the heater humming and the sound of my pulse pounding. I stared at the blank phone screen, half expecting it to light up again instantly. It didn't. I walked to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and tried to swallow the knot in my throat. The untouched cranberry cobbler was still sitting on the counter, its foil slightly wrinkled. I lifted the corner, looked at the perfect crust, then pressed the foil back down. The pie wasn't the only thing that had been rejected. I sank into a chair and rested my forehead against my hand. Something wasn't right. Dad had never cared about the cabin, not the way Mom did, not the way I did. He visited it maybe twice a year at most, usually with a toolbox and a quick comment about how the trees needed trimming. He had never called it family property. He had never cared about renovations or income streams. This sudden obsession wasn't his. It was Noah's, Victoria's. People who saw opportunity everywhere, especially in places that didn't belong to them. I closed my eyes, replaying the conversation, the urgency, the entitlement, the way he dismissed everything else my feelings last night history so he could focus on the cabin. It all felt rehearsed, like someone had already convinced him he had a right to it. A slow, cold certainty crept into my chest. This wasn't about family. This was about control and gain, and seeing me as the obstacle. I stood abruptly, grabbing my coat from the floor. I needed answers. I needed clarity. I needed proof. The file box under my bed creaked when I pulled it out. Inside were the important things Mom had left me: photocopies of wills, letters, old deeds, papers I had avoided reading for years because they felt like invitations to grief. My hands trembled as I lifted the envelope labeled Cabin Transfer Documents. I wasn't ready to open it yet, not fully, but I pressed it against my chest, feeling the weight of decades sealed inside thin paper. If my father was going to push me, I needed to know the truth. I took a deep breath and whispered something into the quiet room, a promise to myself more than anything. This isn't going to be about what they want. It's going to be about what's right. And for the first time since Christmas Eve, the heaviness in my chest shifted. Not gone, but no longer suffocating. I wasn't powerless. Not anymore. I sat cross-legged on the living room floor with the folder open in front of me, the documents spread out like a quiet map of everything my mother had tried to protect. The apartment was still dim, the winter sun barely pushing through the blinds, but the papers felt brighter than the room, like truth had its own light. I took another breath, steadier this time, and picked up the first sheet. Grandma's will. Her handwriting firm but elegant, naming my mother as the sole inheritor of the cabin in Lake Alderwood. Not shared, not contingent, not marital property. Just hers. Mom's will was underneath it. Her handwriting had always been softer, looping, thoughtful. The line leaving the cabin to me was short, just a single sentence, but it felt heavier than any speech my father had given me in years. I read it 4 times. Then I read it again. It wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't vague. It wasn't something that could be twisted by family property speeches or fiancé wish list dreams. It was mine. The crack in my chest widened not from pain, but from clarity. A kind of heat formed behind my ribs, slow but steady, like resolve taking its first breath. I pushed the folder aside and went to the cedar box in my closet. Mom's letter was inside. I hadn't opened it since the week she passed away, when everything I touched felt like a wound. My hands shook as I slid the envelope free. Her handwriting said, "For when you need strength more than reassurance." I exhaled shakily. If now wasn't that moment, I didn't know what was. I unfolded the pages gently, afraid they'd crumble, but they were solid in my hands, just like she had always been. The letter began with memories and apologies for things she wished she'd done differently. But halfway through, her tone shifted. It became precise, intentional. She wrote about how people change after loss, how new partners bring new expectations, how money and property turn generosity into leverage. She didn't know names. She didn't know Victoria or Noah. But she knew human nature. She'd lived long enough to see what people can become when they spot an opportunity they never earned. Then the line that made my throat close. If anyone ever tries to convince you the cabin belongs to more than one person, remember it came to you by choice, not accident. Protect it as if you're protecting yourself. My chest tightened. She knew. Somehow she knew. I pressed the letter against my forehead and breathed in the faint scent of cedar ink and the life she lived before everything fell apart. It grounded me. It steadied me. It reminded me who I was, Someone she trusted with something precious, not someone who should be pushed aside by people who met my father 5 minutes ago. When I finally folded the letter again, my hands weren't trembling anymore. The silence in the apartment shifted. It wasn't heavy now. It was expectant, as if the next move belonged to me. My phone buzzed on the table, a text from Dad. "Bring the key by noon. Noah wants to start today." Start today. They had a schedule, a plan, a timeline that assumed my compliance. I typed nothing back. Instead, I grabbed my coat and keys. Before I left the apartment, I slipped the folder with the documents into my bag, just in case. The streets outside were glazed with thin ice, the kind that made every step feel cautious. I drove slowly, the heater humming my fingers tight around the steering wheel. The world looked washed out white-gray, pale blue, and yet inside my chest, something was burning awake. I didn't drive to Dad's house. I drove to the cabin. The closer I got, the quieter everything became. The trees formed tall arches over the road, their branches heavy with snow. The lake shimmered faintly, half frozen, half reflecting the dull sky. When I stepped out of the car, the cold hit my face like a baptism, sharp, clean. It felt like the perfect place to decide who I wanted to be from this moment on. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. The old wood floors creaked the same way they always had. The air smelled faintly of pine and old books. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing it in. This was home. Not the city. Not Dad's sterile magazine-perfect dining room. Not any space Victoria had curated for important people. This. My boots left faint prints on the floor as I walked through the living room. My fingers skimmed the back of the old sofa, the edge of the mantel, the ceramic bowl Mom bought from a roadside artist 15 years ago. Every piece felt like a heartbeat. I set the folder down on the dining table and opened the curtains. Light poured in softer than the sun in the city, but warmer somehow. Then I sat down, rested my palms on the table, and let the truth settle fully. If I gave Dad the key, even once, I might never get it back. If I hesitated, they would take my silence as permission. If I wavered, they would interpret it as weakness. Mom trusted me to know better. I pulled out my phone. Dad had sent 2 more messages. "We're waiting. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." For once, I wasn't afraid of disappointing him. I typed 4 words slowly, deliberately, each one a boundary, a line in the snow. A truth sealed long before Victoria arrived. "I'm keeping the cabin." I pressed send. The wind outside picked up, brushing against the cabin walls like an ancient warning, or maybe an approval. I didn't move. I didn't apologize. I didn't doubt myself. For the first time in years, I felt exactly like the woman Mom believed I'd grow up to be. Someone who knew when to say no. I drove to Lake Alderwood early the next morning with a thermos of coffee and a weight in my chest that felt both heavy and purposeful. Frost clung to the edges of the windshield, glittering in the weak December sun. The air smelled like pine ice, and something colder beneath it, a warning maybe. I tightened my grip on the wheel, knowing today couldn't be avoided. If Dad wanted to inspect the cabin, I needed to see for myself what they were planning to do with it. The road curved through the forest, each bend familiar from childhood trips with Mom. I used to press my forehead to the window and count how many deer we saw. Back then, the cabin felt like a fairy tale place. The idea that someone I barely considered family now saw it as a stepping stone for profit made my stomach twist. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed it immediately, fresh tire tracks cutting sharply through the snow. 2 sets. My heartbeat stuttered. Someone had already been here. I stepped out of the car, breath turning into pale clouds in the biting air. The snow squeaked under my boots. Old snow doesn't do that, only fresh, undisturbed layers. My hand hovered over the doorknob for a long moment, the cold metal biting into my skin even through my glove. Inside, the air felt different. Still cold from winter, but disturbed somehow, wrong. There was a faint scent of perfume, floral, synthetic, definitely not mine. Not Mom's either. I walked into the living room and froze. Furniture had been moved. Not much, just a few inches off where they always sat, but noticeable to anyone who knew this place intimately. The framed photo of my grandmother on the shelf had been nudged sideways. The knitted throw Mom made years ago had been folded differently, sloppier, like someone didn't care enough to do it right. My jaw tightened. I walked to the kitchen next. On the counter, I found a wedding magazine, its glossy pages splayed open, as if someone had been flipping through it recently. A sticky note was on top. Porch photos would be perfect here, v. Victoria. Of course. Then another note. Ask Claire about upgrades. Could be our long-term investment. I felt my throat go tight. Not with fear. With anger, clean, sharp, clarifying. If I had given Dad the key, they would have treated this as theirs instantly. They already had. I checked the back door next. A faint boot print on the mat. A strand of blonde hair caught near the latch, likely from Victoria's daughter Rachel, who had accidentally broken one of my mugs last Thanksgiving and blamed the table for being too small. I picked up the hair between my fingers, holding it like evidence. They thought they could stroll into this place. They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought I would bend easily because bending is what I always did. But not anymore. I walked into the bedroom Mom used to sleep in. I hadn't stepped foot in here for months. The dust patterns on the dresser told me someone else had touched things. The jewelry box Mom left me, a wooden one with carved flowers, was slightly open. I knelt and inspected the hinge. The clasp had fresh scratches. Someone tried to open it by force. My hands shook for the first time since this all began. Not from weakness. From betrayal so sharp it made the air feel thinner around me. Whoever had done this wasn't just curious, they were searching for something. Papers, maybe. Proof. Anything they could twist into leverage. I stood slowly, clutching the box to my chest. My breath felt heavier, deeper. I whispered into the empty room as if Mom could hear me through the cold walls. I'm not letting them have this. I locked the bedroom door behind me, even though it didn't need locking. The action made me feel grounded. I returned to the living room and stood in front of the window overlooking the frozen lake. The ice shimmered faintly. A crow perched on the railing outside, tilting its head, as if waiting for me to make a decision. I already had. I took out my phone and snapped photos, every moved item, every track in the snow, every fingerprint smudge, every sticky note. I documented everything. I wasn't playing defense anymore. I was collecting evidence. When I finished, I walked out onto the porch and pulled the emergency key from under the old loose stone, something Dad knew about, but always pretended he forgot. I held it for a long moment, remembering all the summers he'd bring me here to fish while Mom cooked inside. He wasn't that man anymore. I walked to the edge of the porch, crouched down, and pushed the spare key deep beneath the stone farther than before. I let the cold numb my fingers, pressing the rock flush to the ground so tightly it would take deliberate effort to move again. Then I reached into my pocket, pulled out the only real cabin key, and closed my fingers around it so hard the metal edges dug into my palm. On the drive back into town, my phone rang. Dad's name lit up the screen. I didn't answer. Not yet. I needed the clarity of my own silence. Because now I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't about a wedding. This wasn't about family property. This wasn't about inclusion or fairness. This was a plan, carefully crafted, already in motion. And if I didn't take control of the narrative now, they would write me out of it entirely. As the cabin disappeared in my rearview mirror, I felt something inside me shift again. Not fear, not grief, resolve, the kind that doesn't break. Dad called again just as I pulled into the parking lot behind my apartment, the phone buzzing so insistently it felt like a warning. I didn't answer. Not yet. The cold air rushed at me as I stepped out of the car, carrying with it the scent of pine from the cabin, like the place itself was still clinging to me, reminding me what was at stake. Inside, the apartment felt too warm, too quiet, too small for everything building inside my chest. I set my bag on the kitchen counter, pulled out the photos I'd taken at the cabin, and spread them out like pieces of a puzzle. The shifted furniture, the sticky notes, the boot prints, the opened jewelry box. My pulse quickened, steady and deliberate. Whoever had been in the cabin wasn't just snooping. They were mapping out what they could turn into shared family property. They were testing boundaries like thieves tugging at windows to see which ones were unlocked. Dad tried calling again. Still, I didn't answer. Instead, I went to the small desk in the corner, the one overflowing with bills, old notebooks, and envelopes I never quite managed to file. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the folder Mom's lawyer had given me right after the funeral. The green ink on the tabs had faded, but the contents were untouched. I sat on the floor, legs crossed, and placed each document beside the photos from the cabin. Grandma's will. Mom's will. The title transfer. The letter she wrote before she died. All the proof I needed. Proof that the cabin didn't just happen to be mine. Proof that it belonged to a lineage, to a promise, one that had nothing to do with Victoria's ambition or Rachel's entitlement or Noah's real estate fantasies. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text Claire pickup. "We need the key today. Don't be dramatic." My chest tightened, not with fear, but with anger so clean it tasted like metal. Dramatic. They'd thrown me out on Christmas Eve. They'd entered the cabin without permission. They'd already made plans for it. And I was dramatic. I tossed my phone aside and kept working. I opened Mom's letter again and read the line I'd underlined earlier that morning. If someone pressures you, that pressure is your answer. Protect what is yours. The truth was starting to take shape, forming a pattern I hadn't seen clearly until now. The comments at Thanksgiving. The way Victoria traced her fingers along the cabin photos when she thought I wasn't looking. The sudden interest in rewriting family traditions. The way Noah had asked about unused spaces like he was shopping for inventory. It all pointed to one thing: they had already decided the cabin was theirs. Dad's abrupt demand for the key wasn't spontaneous. It was a next step in a plan they'd been building quietly, deliberately, while I was too busy trying to keep peace with people who never cared for me in the first place. I headed to my laptop and opened the file I had kept for years, a digital copy of every legal document from the cabin. I scanned through the PDFs, cross-checking the dates, the clauses, the handwritten notes. Everything aligned. No loopholes, no wiggle room, no shared ownership. It was airtight. My phone lit up again. Another text. "Noah and Rachel can meet you at the cabin in an hour. We want to get started." They weren't asking. They were instructing. Like I was a child. Like I didn't own the deed. Like the cabin wasn't legally protected generations before they arrived. The anger surged, but beneath it something stronger rose. Resolve steady and sharp. I grabbed my coat, slipped the documents back into the folder, and headed outside. The cold slapped my face, waking something inside me that had been half asleep for far too long. I didn't get into the car right away. Instead, I leaned against the driver's side and stared at the snow-covered street. I wasn't going to the cabin. Not yet. Not on their schedule. I needed one more piece of information before taking my next step. So I drove not toward Lake Alderwood, but toward the small legal office downtown. The one with the faded blue awning and the lawyer who had handled Mom's estate. I hadn't been back since 2020. The place looked unchanged, like time passed reluctantly here. Inside the lawyer, Ms. Harley recognized me instantly. Her eyes softened the way people's eyes do when they remember someone at their worst moment. "Claire," she said, "I'm so sorry for your loss. How can I help today?" I sat down across from her, the folder in my lap. The words came out steady. "I need clarity, and I need it in writing." She listened as I explained everything Dad's demands. Victoria's behavior, the sticky notes, the forced jewelry box clasp, the pressure, the plans. She didn't interrupt. She didn't judge. When I finished, she opened Grandma's will and Mom's will, placing them side by side like twin anchors. "Claire," she said gently, "your mother couldn't have made this clearer. The cabin is yours." "I know," I whispered. but they're acting like it's theirs. That doesn't matter, she said. Intent does not override law. She typed something on her computer, printing out a single crisp page. She slid it toward me. This is a legal confirmation letter stating that the cabin belongs exclusively to you and has never been marital property in any generation. Keep this with the rest of your documents. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. She leaned forward. And Claire, if they try to pressure you again, you do not negotiate with people who see you as an obstacle. Her words lodged deep. I left the office with the letter in my hands and the cold air biting at my cheeks. When I got back into the car, Dad had left one final message. Answer me. We don't have time for this. Bring the key. I stared at the screen for a long moment before closing my eyes. Then I whispered almost to myself, you don't get to demand anything from me anymore. I didn't send it yet. But I would. Soon. And when I did, everything would change. Dad was waiting on the other end of the call before I even pressed the phone to my ear. The moment the line connected, his voice came through, clipped and impatient like he'd been pacing with the phone in his hand for hours. Claire. Finally. Where are you? We're all waiting. Noah says I didn't let him finish. Dad, stop. I'm not giving you the key. Silence so sudden and heavy that for a moment I wondered if the call had dropped. Then came a sharp exhale like he was trying to swallow frustration before it burst. Claire, he said, voice tightening. This isn't the time for one of your moods. There are people depending on you. This affects the whole family. You need to stop being difficult. There it was. The same tone he used when I was 12 and forgot to bring in the groceries fast enough. The tone that said, you don't get to have boundaries. I leaned back against the car seat, keeping my voice steady. This isn't about a mood. The cabin is mine, legally, completely. I'm not handing over anything. He scoffed a sharp, dismissive sound. Your mother wouldn't want you acting like this. I closed my eyes. He always reached for her when logic failed him, as if her memory was a lever he could pull to move me where he wanted. Dad, I said quietly, you don't get to use Mom to guilt me. Not today. He paused again, longer this time. I could picture him standing in the kitchen, rubbing his forehead, looking at Victoria for support. I heard muffled voices in the background, someone whispering, probably her. Then his breath hit the receiver again. You're being selfish, he said. We're only asking for one key. One. Do you have any idea how wonderful it would be for the family to have a place we can actually use together? Do you know how much stress you're causing? The word stress made me laugh. It slipped out before I could stop it. Dad, I'm not the one breaking into places or demanding access to property that isn't mine. Break in, he snapped. No one broke in. Stop exaggerating. Maybe Noah stepped inside, but you just admitted it. His breath caught. He realized it too late. I didn't give him time to recover. My voice came out calm, too calm. Dad, someone moved furniture. Someone touched Mom's jewelry box. Someone left notes planning renovations. That isn't what you think. It's exactly what I think. He cursed under his breath, the first crack in his controlled tone. Claire, sweetheart, listen, this is normal. Families share things. When Victoria suggested we start planning, it wasn't about taking anything from you. It was about bringing us together, and Noah is just trying to help. He knows real estate. You're misinterpreting everything. There it was again, the rewriting, the minimizing, the soft manipulation. I pictured the sticky notes again. Ask Claire about upgrades. Could be our long-term investment. Our, not mine, not your cabin. Ours. My jaw tightened. Dad, I said, my voice dropping lower. I know what Victoria is trying to do. And I know Noah's role in this too. And what's that supposed to mean? It means I'm not blind. And I'm not a child. Stop pretending this is innocent. He inhaled sharply. Do you hear yourself? This is paranoia. Victoria cares about you. No, I cut in. She cares about the cabin. There's a difference. Another silence. Longer. Tense. Static hummed through the phone like the line itself was straining. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Not angry, not desperate. Cold. Claire, he said, if you refuse to cooperate, don't expect us to include you moving forward. Victoria is doing her best to create a united family. If you can't appreciate that, then maybe... Stop. I couldn't listen to another fabricated ultimatum. You shut me out on Christmas Eve, I said. You told me to go away because I wasn't important enough for your dinner. And now you're asking for the cabin key like nothing happened. That was different, he snapped. We had guests. We were hosting an important dinner. It wasn't personal. I laughed again, this time sharper. You yelled through the door, Dad. You didn't even open it. You made sure I heard every insult. He didn't deny it. That alone told me everything. But then his voice softened too quickly, too practiced. Claire, honey, we're under pressure. The wedding planning has been chaos. The cabin would solve so much. Noah ran numbers. I cut him off again. There it is. The real reason. Not family, not memories, not love. Numbers. He fell silent. Caught. I pressed 2 fingers to my forehead, closing my eyes. Dad, you can't guilt me into giving you something that doesn't belong to you. I talked to Ms. Harley today. The cabin was never marital property, not in your marriage to Mom, not in your marriage to Victoria. It's mine. He didn't speak. So I said the words I knew he wasn't ready to hear, 5 words that had been forming all day. You have no legal claim. There was an audible intake of breath on his end. Like I'd punched him through the phone. He tried to say something, tried twice, but the words tangled. Claire, you don't mean that. I do. You're choosing property over family. You chose strangers over your daughter. The silence after that was thick enough to feel. Then, barely audible, he whispered, I didn't think you'd ever say that to me. It broke something in me. But not the way he thought. It broke the illusion I had clung to for years that my father would choose me simply because I was his child. I opened my eyes, slowly, staring at the winter sky outside the windshield. Dad, I said softly, I'm not trying to fight you. I'm trying to protect what Mom entrusted me with. And if you can't understand that, then maybe you're not the one who should be lecturing me about family. He exhaled shakily, like the person feeding him lines in the background had finally stepped back. I don't know what to say, he muttered. You don't have to say anything, I replied. Just hear me. Another long pause. Then quietly, we'll talk later. He hung up. I sat in the car long after the call ended, the cold creeping through the windshield, my breath fogging the air. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel powerless. I felt like a woman who finally understood her own worth. And I wasn't backing down. The next morning started with a pounding on my door so loud it rattled the picture frames on the wall. I jolted upright on the couch, heart kicking hard, the blanket sliding off my shoulders. For a split second I thought it was Dad, but it wasn't his knock. Dad's knock had a rhythm, 3 taps, then a pause, then one more. This knock was aggressive, impatient, territorial. I crossed the living room slowly, pulse rising. When I peered through the peephole, my stomach tightened. Victoria. Her blonde hair was perfectly curled despite the wind. Her coat looked expensive fur at the collar, and her lipstick was a sharp winter red. She looked like she'd stepped out of a catalog titled Elegant Manipulation. Behind her, Rachel stood with crossed arms and a face that said she had come ready for drama. I opened the door halfway, blocking their entry with my shoulder. Victoria smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was a smile meant to disarm most people. I'd fallen for it once. Not anymore. Claire, honey, she said sweetly, we need to talk. I leaned against the doorframe, unmoved. Then talk. She blinked clearly, thrown by my lack of invitation inside. She smoothed her hair back, regained her posture, and went straight into her rehearsed speech. Your father is very upset. You caused quite a scene yesterday. We're all trying to figure out why you're being so unreasonable about the cabin. My jaw tightened. The cabin that belongs to me. Rachel scoffed loudly. God, here we go again. Victoria shot her a warning glance before continuing. Claire's sweetheart families share things, especially properties, especially sentimental ones. She put a hand over her heart as if invoking Mom's memory while entirely misunderstanding it. We were just planning ahead, trying to make sure your sister has the wedding she deserves. Stepsister, I corrected quietly. Not sister. Victoria's smile flickered, but she recovered quickly. Labels don't matter in blended families, dear. They matter when someone is using them to take things. The sweetness in her expression thinned to frustration. Claire, this attitude is hurting people. You embarrassed your father. You stressed out Rachel and Noah. Do you even understand how much work we've put into planning? We made decisions based on the assumption that you'd be supportive. I crossed my arms. You made decisions based on the assumption I wouldn't fight back. Rachel rolled her eyes. This is ridiculous. It's not even that great of a cabin. Mom just wanted to help Dad finally have something nice. You should be grateful someone cares enough to upgrade your old shack. My breath froze. Did you just call my grandmother's cabin a shack? Rachel shrugged. Well, it kind of is. Victoria cut in quickly, sensing the heat rising. We're not here to argue. We're here to resolve. We just need the key, Claire. Noah's ready to start renovations today. The Airbnb potential. I held up my hand. Stop. Just stop. Her mouth snapped shut like a puppet whose strings were abruptly cut. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me so we were all on the concrete walkway, the freezing air slicing between us. You entered the cabin without permission, I said. You moved things. You touched Mom's belongings. You left notes as if you were the one making plans. And now you're standing here telling me I'm unreasonable. Rachel folded her arms tighter. Victoria's jaw twitched. We didn't break in, she insisted. The back door was unlocked. Anyone could have walked in. That's irresponsible, Claire. We were doing you a favor by checking on things. I stared at her. Really stared, and realized she believed her own lie. Or she needed to believe it so she could sleep at night. Victoria, I said softly, you are not my mother. You are not entitled to anything that belonged to her. And you don't get to decide what family property is. This isn't yours. She stiffened, insulted. I married your father. What's his is mine. The cabin was never his, I said. Not legally, not emotionally, not ever. Her face paled, then flushed anger taking over. You ungrateful mom left me a letter I cut in. I know exactly why the cabin is mine and why she structured it the way she did. She knew people might try to talk their way into it. Victoria froze. Your mother, she said with a clipped tone, was a sentimental woman who didn't understand blended families. I stepped forward, closing the space between us. My mother understood human nature better than you think. She protected me from situations exactly like this. Rachel scoffed again. Oh my God, we're seriously doing this, Mom. We should just leave. She's delusional. Dad will handle her. Victoria straightened her voice, sharpening. Claire, if you don't give us the key, your father will have no choice but to reconsider your involvement in. I lifted my hand again. Don't finish that sentence. She blinked, startled. Victoria. I said, my voice low and steady. Dad already lost me the minute he chose you over me at that door. I'm only considering fixing things with him because I still believe he's capable of seeing the truth. But you, I shook my head. You have shown me exactly who you are. A beat of silence. Then Victoria whispered, You'll regret this. I smiled faintly, not kindly. No, I said. I regret letting this go on as long as I did. I stepped back and pointed toward the parking lot. "You're done here. Leave." Rachel inhaled sharply. "You can't talk to my mom like that. I just did." Victoria's eyes blazed. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to slap me. Then she seemed to think better of it. Instead, she straightened her coat, turned sharply, and marched toward her car. Rachel followed, muttering every insult she could think of under her breath. When the car finally pulled away, spraying slush across the asphalt, I stood alone in the bitter morning air, breath rising in pale clouds. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from adrenaline, from clarity, from the unmistakable feeling that a line had finally been drawn and not a single inch of it was negotiable anymore. Inside, my phone buzzed with a new message from Dad. But this time I didn't flinch when I read it. Not anymore. Because now I knew exactly what needed to happen next. Dad called 5 times before I finally picked up, and when I did, his voice came through tight, breathless, like he'd just run up a flight of stairs or argued with someone until he lost his air. "Claire, what happened? Victoria is furious. She said you threatened her." I closed my eyes and leaned against the kitchen counter. I didn't threaten anyone. I told her to leave. She showed up at my door demanding keys to something that doesn't belong to her. A frustrated groan tore through the receiver. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "No," I said quietly. "I'm finally seeing things the way they are." For a moment, all I heard was his breathing, uneven and ragged. Then, "Where are you at home? I'm coming over." "No," I said quickly. "You're not." He froze. I could hear it. I could feel it. "You don't get to just avoid me," he said, his voice shaky with anger and a strange desperation. "We're family." The word family sat between us like a stone. "Dad," I said, "I am not having a screaming match in a hallway or letting you bring Victoria into my home again. If we're talking, it will be somewhere neutral." He hesitated, like where I swallowed the idea coming to me as I spoke. "The cabin." Silence stretched thin and sharp. "Fine," he finally said. "Be there in an hour." When he hung up, the only sound in the apartment was the hum of the refrigerator and the pounding of my own heart. I grabbed my coat, my keys, the folder of documents, and Mom's letter, then drove. The winter sky was low and pale, the kind of white that felt heavy like a warning before a storm. The closer I got to Lake Alderwood, the more the trees around the road leaned in silent and solemn. The cabin sat at the clearing like it always had, unbothered by the chaos circling it. Dad's truck was already parked in the driveway. I forced myself to breathe before stepping out of the car. My boots crunched over the snow as I walked toward him. He stood near the porch, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes searching mine for some version of the daughter he thought he could control. "Let's go inside," he said. "No," I answered. "We talk out here." His eyebrows pulled together. "Why?" "Because I don't trust who's been inside." He flinched but didn't deny it. Instead, he took a slow breath and motioned for me to start. "You're digging your heels in," he said. "And for what? A cabin you hardly ever use. You're turning this into a war." "I'm responding to a war you already started," I said calmly. "I know about Victoria's questions. I know about Noah's visit here last week. I know Rachel tried to open the jewelry box. I know all of it." His lips parted. For the first time, he looked genuinely caught off guard. How do you know that, Ms. Collins? Grandma's old neighbor." I held his gaze. "She told me everything, and she's willing to tell the truth again if needed." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked away, guilt flickering across his face, but then something else slid over it. Shame, anger, embarrassment. Or maybe the fear of realizing he'd been played. "Claire," he said softly, "Victoria was just trying to help. Help herself," I corrected. "And she brought Noah and Rachel into it. They weren't just curious, they were scouting. They were testing what they could get away with." Dad's shoulders sagged, but he didn't speak. I pulled out the folder and held it out. These papers are clear. Grandma left the cabin to Mom. Mom left it to me. This place was never your marital property, not with her, and definitely not with Victoria. He didn't take the folder. He just stared at it like it was something radioactive. "Claire," he whispered. "I didn't know." "Yes, you did," I said. "You just didn't want to see it." He closed his eyes. "I thought—" His voice broke. "I thought giving Victoria something to look forward to would make blending our families easier. She said you were distant. She said you didn't try. She said the cabin would bring us together." I felt something inside me twist, not pity, but recognition. "She lied," I said. "She lied because she knew you would believe her over me. And you did." His eyes opened raw and confused. "I didn't think it would go this far." "It did." He rubbed his hands over his face, looking older than he had even last week. "She told me you didn't care about the cabin," he said. "She told me you always seemed uninterested in family gatherings. She said you didn't want to be part of anything unless it benefited you." My stomach dropped. "She said that—" He nodded slowly. "She said you were cold." I drew in a sharp breath. "Dad, she was manipulating you." He nodded again this time in a broken, shaky motion. I realize that now. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind rustled the branches overhead, brushing snowflakes from the pines. When he finally looked up at me, there was something new in his eyes. Fear. Not of me, but of what he had become under someone else's influence. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he whispered. "I swear I didn't." "But you did," I said softly. "And you let other people help you do it." He nodded again. His voice cracked. "I let you stand on that porch on Christmas Eve," he said. "I let you freeze out there. I didn't even open the door." A tear slid down his cheek. I had never seen my father cry before. Not when Grandma died. Not when Mom passed. Not when he remarried. He wiped it away quickly like it betrayed him. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. I took a slow breath. "Start by accepting the truth," I said. "You don't get the cabin. They don't get the cabin. This place stays with me." He nodded, and I added, "You cut them out of decisions about things that don't belong to them. Starting now." He let the words sink in. Then he nodded again, this time with conviction. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." For a moment, he looked like the dad I used to know, the man before grief, before fear, before someone else whispered poison into his ear. But we weren't done. I opened the folder and pulled out Mom's letter, holding it toward him. "This," I said, "is who I'm honoring. Not Victoria. Not Noah. Not Rachel. Not even you when you're being pulled in the wrong direction." He reached for the letter with trembling fingers, his eyes glassy, his breath shaky. The cold wind cut through us, but between us, something shifted, barely but real. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the beginning of a reckoning neither of us could avoid anymore. And he wasn't the only one who would face one. Because Victoria had no idea what was coming next. Dad didn't call that night, and I didn't expect him to. He needed time to face the truth he'd been avoiding, and I needed time to prepare for the confrontation I knew was coming. Victoria wouldn't let this go quietly. People like her didn't surrender. They recalculated, regrouped, and retaliated. By the next morning, my phone was vibrating nonstop. 3 missed calls from Dad, 2 from an unknown number, 1 voicemail from Rachel that was 30 seconds of incoherent anger. I didn't listen to it. Instead, I drove to a small coffee shop near downtown and took a seat in the corner, my back-to-the-wall documents in my bag. I wanted to be somewhere public when I called Dad back. Not because I was scared he'd yell, but because I had learned that controlling the environment was the quickest way to stay steady. When the line connected, he sounded tired. Really tired. Claire, he said we need to meet. Today. We're your grandmother's cabin, he said quietly. I want everyone there. We all need to talk. Everyone. My pulse tightened. Who exactly is everyone? I asked. He hesitated. Victoria, Rachel, and Noah. Of course. I leaned back in the booth and stared out the window at the steady fall of snow. Cars crawled through the slush. People hurried past, bundled in scarves, their breath puffing in the air. The world was cold but simple. My life was cold and complicated. All right, I said. But I'm bringing the documents. His voice cracked. I know. I expect you to. After the call, I stayed there for a long time, letting my coffee grow cold while my thoughts gathered like storm clouds. I wasn't scared of them. Not anymore. But I was preparing because this wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be exposure. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky was turning a muted gray and the wind had picked up. Dad's truck was there. So was Victoria's sleek SUV. Noah's car parked beside it. Rachel stood on the porch with her arms crossed like a guard dog protecting a house that didn't belong to her. Her glare sharpened when she saw me. Well, look who finally decided to show up, she muttered. I walked past her without acknowledging the bait. I opened the door and stepped into the warmth of the cabin. The heat hummed through the vents, but the room felt colder than outside. Victoria stood near the fireplace, stiff-backed and elegant in a winter white coat. Her eyes were icy and sharp. Noah leaned against the wall, arms folded, wearing an expression he probably thought signaled professional disappointment. Dad sat at the table, shoulders heavy, eyes downcast. They all looked at me like I was the last piece of a puzzle they'd been trying to force into place. Let's sit, Dad said, gesturing to the table. I set my bag down and took my seat, calm and quiet. I felt like the center of a storm, and strangely, the calmest one there. Victoria started immediately. Claire, your behavior lately has been unacceptable. You've caused tension between everyone and your father is exhausted. We're here because we want to resolve this. We want what's best for the family. I almost laughed. Instead, I folded my hands on the table. What's best for the family, I repeated. Or what's best for you. Her nostrils flared. Don't twist my words. I leaned forward. You twisted them first. Dad cleared his throat, but before he could speak, Noah chimed in, his tone irritatingly smooth. Claire, nobody is trying to take advantage of you. We just thought the cabin could be put to better use. It's outdated. It needs upgrades. And frankly, you're not in a position to maintain a place like this on your own. I narrowed my eyes. Excuse me? He shrugged. We're all adults here. You're drowning financially, everybody knows it. Turning this into an Airbnb could help you. Help all of us, Rachel piped up with a smirk. You're acting like some princess guarding a castle. It's ridiculous. I turned slowly toward her. You opened my grandmother's jewelry box. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Her face drained of color. She glanced at Victoria, whose expression didn't change except for a slight tightening around the eyes. I don't know what you're talking about, Rachel blurted. I reached into my bag and placed the folder on the table. You've all been very busy, I said quietly, asking questions, walking through the cabin, planning renovations without permission, and now pretending it's about helping me. So let's skip the performance. Dad dropped his gaze again, shame flickering across his face. I opened the folder and laid out the documents, the wills, the title transfer, the lawyer's official letter from the day before. Victoria's eyes widened. Noah's posture shifted, suddenly less confident. Rachel looked confused, as if she genuinely hadn't considered legal ownership before committing emotional theft. I placed my hand on the papers. These are the facts, I said. Grandma left the cabin to Mom. Mom left it to me. It has never been marital property ever. Not in Dad's first marriage, not in his second. Not now. This place is legally, financially, and historically mine alone. Dad swallowed hard but didn't argue. Victoria did. "This is absurd," she snapped. "Just because something is written on paper?" "No," I said firmly. "Because something is written on paper and because it's the truth. You don't get to rewrite it." Noah leaned forward, jaw tight. "We put money into planning. We've invested time." "Then you wasted it," I said simply. Victoria's voice grew venomous. "You're choosing a building over your family." I shook my head. "No. I'm choosing myself over people who never treated me like family." The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Dad finally spoke, voice rough. "They used me, Claire. They pushed me. I didn't see it until now." For the first time, Victoria looked stunned, not by anger, but by the realization that she had lost her foothold. Noah stood abruptly. "We're done here." Rachel followed him out, shoving past me on her way to the door. Victoria stayed a moment longer, eyes flicking between me and Dad's stunned fury simmering beneath her perfect makeup. "This isn't over," she whispered. "It is," Dad said quietly behind me. "It's over." When she finally left, the cabin door slammed so hard the windows rattled. Dad stayed seated, hands trembling on the table. "Claire," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." I nodded slowly, feeling the truth of the moment settle into the wooden walls around us. For the first time, he wasn't apologizing to gain something. He was apologizing because he finally saw everything. And this time I didn't look away. Dad stayed seated after Victoria stomped out his hands, still trembling on the table, as if the truth had shaken something loose inside him. I didn't rush him. I didn't soothe him. I just let the silence settle in the cabin like snowfall, quiet, steady, inescapable. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red, his voice low. "I don't know how I let it get this far." I folded the last document back into the folder and closed it gently. "You didn't see it coming." "That's how." He shook his head. "No, I didn't want to see it. That's the difference." He leaned back in his chair, the wooden legs creaking under the weight of a man who had finally stopped running from himself. "I thought," he said with a shaky breath, "if I made Victoria happy, she'd make everything easier. I didn't want to lose another family after losing your mom." The words hit me hard. They were honest in a way I hadn't expected. Painfully honest. "Dad," I said quietly, "you didn't lose me. You pushed me away." He winced, nodding. "I know. God, I know." For a moment his shoulders shook, not from tears, but from the exhaustion of finally admitting what he'd done. "I let her convince me you were difficult," he said, "that you didn't care about the family, that you were selfish. And I believed it because it was easier than facing the grief I never dealt with." This time my breath caught. He'd never said anything like that. Not once. He rubbed his hands over his face. "When I yelled at you on Christmas Eve, I heard myself. I heard the words coming out of my mouth and I hated myself even as I said them. But I didn't stop." He looked up at me, and the expression in his eyes made the room feel too small. "You stood outside in the cold. My daughter." His voice broke. "And I didn't open the door." My throat tightened. I looked away, blinking hard. He pushed back from the table and stood slowly walking to the window overlooking the frozen lake. Snow was falling now, thin flakes drifting across the surface in soft spirals. "When your mom died," he said, "I felt empty in a way I can't explain. Victoria made me feel wanted again. Needed." She filled the silence. "She filled it with control," I said gently. He nodded. "I see that now." I moved toward him, stopping a few feet away. "Dad, why didn't you tell me any of this earlier?" He kept his eyes on the lake. "Because I was ashamed, and because Victoria didn't want me talking to you without her." My stomach twisted. "She controlled your conversations with me." He nodded once. "She said it was for family unity." I didn't realize she meant hers, not mine. The truth of that settled between us heavy and undeniable. I let out a breath. So what now? He turned toward me, and for the first time that day, he stood straighter. Now, he said, I set things right. How I didn't know. But something about his posture, about the way he said it, made me believe he meant it. He looked toward the door Victoria had slammed, then back at the documents on the table. I want to talk to a lawyer, he said. I want to make sure nothing she or her kids have touched is tied to my assets, and I want to protect what's left of my relationship with you. The words came out rough but sincere. I exhaled slowly. That's a good first step. He walked back to the table and picked up Mom's letter, the one he had read maybe 15 minutes earlier, but seemed to carry the weight of years. She knew, he whispered. Your mother. She saw further than I ever could. I nodded. She trusted you once, but she trusted me with this. He looked at me then, and something in his gaze softened, not the weakness of guilt, but the strength of someone choosing honesty over pride. I don't deserve your forgiveness, he said, but I'm going to earn it. I didn't offer it. Not yet. Forgiveness wasn't a handshake. It was a long road, but I gave him a small nod, and that the small nod broke something loose in him. The tightness in his jaw unwound. His shoulders dropped. He looked relieved in a way he hadn't looked since before Mom got sick. We sat quietly for a moment, both watching the snow fall outside, each caught in our own thoughts. Then he said something that caught me off guard. I want to apologize to you properly. Not here. Not while everything's raw. But soon. I want to sit down, just the two of us, and say everything I should have said years ago. A warmth, not forgiveness, but something adjacent, stirred faintly in my chest. That sounds fair, I said. He nodded and wiped his face again. Then, unexpectedly, he let out a tired, humorless laugh. You know what the worst part is? What I really believed they cared about me. I stepped closer, gently touching his arm. They cared about what you could give them, not you. He nodded slowly. I see that now. The heater clicked on. Snow brushed against the windows. The cabin felt like it was breathing with us, like it knew this was a turning point. Dad took a deep breath. If you're willing, I'd like to start over with you. Not pretend the past didn't happen, but build something new. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was more than I expected. I took a slow breath. We'll see, I said. Healing takes time. He nodded. I'll take whatever time you're willing to give. We left the cabin quietly, locking it behind us. As we stepped out onto the porch, he glanced at me with a small, tentative smile. Will you come to breakfast with me sometime? Just us. I found myself nodding. Yeah, I think I can do that. He exhaled shakily, relief flooding his face. Then he walked toward his truck, each step heavy but resolute, like a man finally choosing the right road after wandering the wrong one for too long. I stood in the snow watching him pull away, and for the first time in weeks the cold didn't feel like something pressing down on me. It felt clean, clear, like a world resetting. And somewhere deep inside, a tiny part of me finally felt warm. The days after the confrontation at the cabin were strangely quiet, like the air itself had settled into a new shape. No more pounding on my door, no more frantic texts, no more demands for the key. Even Dad's messages were gentler, short check-ins instead of frantic pleas. But quiet didn't mean everything was fixed. It meant the dust was finally settling, which is when you see what's actually broken. 2 days later, I woke up to a soft morning sun creeping through the blinds and the faint humming of the heater. I checked my phone out of habit and saw a single message from Dad. Can we talk today? Just us? I made a reservation. I stared at the screen for a long moment. A reservation. That alone told me more than the words did. Dad was trying in a way he hadn't tried in years. Intentional, thoughtful, not reactive. I typed a simple yes, and spent the next hour getting ready, nerves fluttering beneath my ribs. The restaurant he chose wasn't fancy. It was a little diner on the edge of town, the kind with mismatched mugs and a bell that rings when the door opens. The kind of place Mom used to take me after school sometimes when the world felt too loud. When I walked inside, Dad was already seated in a booth near the window, hands wrapped tightly around a mug he probably hadn't touched. He stood when he saw me nervous in a way that made him look younger and older all at once. "Claire," he said softly. "Thank you for coming." I nodded and slid into the booth. The waitress came by, poured me coffee, and left us alone. Dad cleared his throat twice before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot," he said. "About everything. About you. About what happened." I waited. I wasn't going to make this easy. I wasn't cushioning the blow for him. He took a breath. "I let people who barely knew us tell me who you were, and I believed them more than I believed my own daughter." The admission hit me harder than I expected. He kept going. "I let Victoria convince me that the cabin wasn't important to you, that you didn't care about the memories, that you were distant, cold." His voice faltered. "But the truth is, you weren't distant. You were surviving. And I didn't see it." I swallowed my throat tight. He rubbed his forehead with his palm like the weight of his own choices had finally sunk in. "I failed you, Claire. I failed you on Christmas. I failed you long before that." I didn't speak. I needed him to finish. My grief made me blind. And Victoria's flattery made me feel needed again. His voice cracked. I didn't realize I was choosing validation over my own child. There it was. The truth neither of us had been able to say aloud until now. I let out a shaky breath. "Dad, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I just needed you to choose me sometimes." His eyes filled, but he blinked the tears back. "I know. And I didn't. But I'm going to now." He reached into his coat pocket and slid a folded paper across the table. I stared at it. "What's this protection?" he said. "My lawyer helped me draft it last night." I unfolded it slowly. It took me a moment to process what I was looking at. A notarized affidavit, signed, dated. It stated clearly and officially that the cabin belonged solely to me. He had no past, present, or future claim to it. He acknowledged Mom's intention and my legal inheritance. And he renounced any rights anyone, including future partners, might try to claim through him. My breath caught. "Dad." He swallowed hard. "I wanted you to know in writing that I won't let anyone come after that cabin again." I didn't expect the tears, but they came anyway, slow and quiet. Dad reached across the table but stopped halfway as if waiting for permission. I placed my hand over his, and his shoulders sagged with relief. The waitress returned, refilled our coffee, and smiled politely before walking away. Dad watched her go, his jaw trembling slightly, then turned back to me. "I talked to Victoria," he said. My stomach tightened. "And she moved out yesterday." I blinked. "What?" He nodded once, eyes tired. "Said she needed someone who supported her plans, someone who didn't let outsiders dictate decisions." My breath stilled. "She meant me." "She did," he said. And when I didn't back her up, she packed her things. The relief that washed over me was complicated, warm and cold at once. Dad looked out the window for a long moment, watching the snow drift lazily through the air. "I realized something," he said. "I was trying so hard not to be alone again that I didn't notice I'd already lost the people who mattered." I felt the ache in those words. "Dad, you're not alone," I said softly. "Not if you choose better this time." He nodded slowly. "I want to. I want to start choosing you. And I know it'll take time for you to trust that." "It will," I said honestly. "But this?" I lifted the affidavit. "This helps." When breakfast ended, he walked me to my car like he used to when I was 17 and coming home from late shifts. The snow had started falling harder, white flakes drifting across his coat and settling in his hair. He hesitated before speaking again. "Will you come to dinner next week?" he asked. "Nothing big, just us. No expectations. I smiled faintly. Ask me again in a few days. I'm not ready to pretend everything's healed. He nodded like he expected that. That's fair, he said quietly. Fair is more than I've been to you. We hugged, awkward, hesitant, but genuine. When I stepped back, he looked steadier than he had all morning. As I drove away, the affidavit resting safely in my bag, the world outside looked different. Not brighter, not fixed, but open. Like a door left ajar after a long winter. Like warmth waiting on the other side. The snow had already begun to melt by the time the next weekend rolled around, leaving the roads wet and streaked with silver. I drove toward Lake Alderwood with the windows cracked just enough to let in the crisp early spring air. The cabin sat at the end of the winding road, quiet and solid exactly as it had always been. But for the first time in months, walking up to it didn't feel like bracing for a fight. It felt like coming home. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and the familiar smell of cedar and old books wrapped around me like a warm coat. Light filtered through the windows, settling softly on the wooden floors. I set my bag down and walked slowly through the rooms, touching the back of a chair, the edge of the mantel, the framed picture of Mom that still hung above the table. Everything was where it should be. Everything that mattered was still here. I brewed a small pot of coffee on the old stove, letting the kitchen fill with the scent, then carried a mug to the porch. The lake shimmered under the sun, the ice finally gone. Birds hopped in the snowless patches near the trees. It was the first truly quiet moment I'd had in weeks. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps crunching in the snow. I didn't tense because I already knew who it was. Dad appeared at the edge of the porch, hands tucked awkwardly into his jacket pockets. I knocked, he said, but I guess you didn't hear me. I smiled a little. The cabin absorbed sound. Come sit. He sat beside me on the wooden step, taking in the view like he hadn't really seen it before. We stayed quiet for a while, sipping coffee, the wind brushing gently across our faces. You know, he said finally, your mother loved this porch. She used to say the world always looked honest from here. I nodded. I know. She used to say that to me too. He chuckled softly. She really did see so far ahead. I just wish I'd listened more. There was something fragile in his voice, something real and shaped by regret. But there was strength too, the kind that only comes from telling the truth out loud. We talked for a long time about Mom, about the mess we'd crawled out of, about the things we each could have done differently. It wasn't a perfect conversation. It wasn't meant to be. But it was honest, and it was steady. Eventually, he cleared his throat and stood up, brushing snow off his boots. I know I have work to do, he said. A lot of it. But if you'll let me, I'd like to be part of your life again. Slowly. At whatever pace feels right to you. I looked up at him, the sunlight hitting the side of his face, making him look older, but also softer. I think I said that's exactly what Mom would have wanted. He nodded, eyes misty. Can I take you to dinner this week? Nothing fancy. Just a chance to start again. I smiled. Ask me tomorrow. He laughed at that. Really laughed, and the sound echoed through the trees. For the first time, it didn't hurt to hear it. When he walked back toward his truck, he paused at the end of the porch. Claire, he said, turning back to me. Thank you for fighting for this place. For yourself. For your mother. I should have been the one standing between you and all of that. But you stood for both of us. My chest tightened, but in a warm way. It's okay, Dad. I'm standing now. He nodded once before heading down the path. When his truck disappeared around the bend, the world went quiet again. I carried my mug back inside and sat at the table, sunlight warming my hands through the glass. I opened my sketchbook, something I hadn't touched since before Christmas, and ran my fingers over the pages. Plans for the design studio filled the first few spreads. Color palettes, furniture ideas, names scribbled in margins. Dreams I had pushed aside while trying to survive. Now I finally had space to breathe again, and space to build. I looked around my cabin, and felt a clarity settle in my chest like a stone finally finding its place. This place wasn't a bargaining chip. It wasn't leverage. It wasn't a symbol of conflict. It was my foundation. And now I was ready to grow from it. The wind rustled the trees outside, and a flock of birds rose from the lake, scattering into the sunlight. I took a deep breath and whispered into the quiet room as if Mom could still hear me. "I'm okay. I promise." As I closed the sketchbook, a thought settled over me, gentle but strong, like a final note to a long, painful song. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't confrontation. It's building a life they never thought you were strong enough to claim. And I was ready to claim mine. If you listened all the way to the end, I'd love to know what would you have done in my place. Tell me in the comments, and if you want more stories like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and stay with me for the next chapter of this journey.